In this video, we're going to be talking about writing equations in standard form. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to write equations in standard form given the x and the y-intercepts and other points. And you should also be able to change the form of an equation. When we're writing equations in standard form, it's important for us to note that the standard form equation is ax plus by equals c. Note that the x and the y, the variables of x and y, are on the same side. A and b cannot both be 0, so when we're writing equations in standard form, you must have either an a or a b. They could both be there, but at least one has to be present in the equation in order for it to be in standard form. The coefficients must be integers, so a, b, and c. The coefficients of a and b and the constant of c cannot be fractions, cannot be decimals, so they need to be integers. That's a whole number or its opposite. And the coefficient of a must be positive, so a cannot be negative. So when we're writing equations in standard forms, you need to keep those stipulations, those requirements in mind. So if a happens to be negative, when you're writing it in standard form, to get rid of that negative, to clear it, you would multiply everything by -1. If when you're writing things in standard form, you end up with fractions, the way to get rid of those fractions, the way to clear those fractions would be to multiply the entire equation by the common denominator. And if the greatest common factor between the three terms is not 1, then you would divide by that GCF so that the GCF would become 1. When we're writing the equation from the x and the y-intercepts, you need to identify the x and the y-intercepts. That could be from a graph, from a table, or from the word problems. Remember that the x and the y-intercepts in this case, the x-intercept is when y is 0, and the y-intercept is when x is 0. Once you have those two points, then you can use those 2 points to find the slope. And then once you have the slope and the y-intercept, then you can write it in slope-intercept form, and then you can change it or convert it into standard form. So let's practice before we jump into the writing piece, and let's see if we can recall how to find the x and the y-intercepts and the slope given an equation. So remember that if we're using if we're finding the x and the y-intercepts, to find the x-intercept, we would make the y value 0. And so instead of 5y, we would have 5 times 0. That 5 times 0 part would go away because 5 times 0 is 0, and we don't necessarily need to write that. And then we would have negative 3x equals 15, and we could solve dividing both sides by 3 and get x is equal to -5. And so our x-intercept in this case would be -5, 0, because when y is 0, x is -5. When we're finding the y-intercept, we're doing the same thing, except this time we're going to make the x value 0, because the y-intercept is when x is 0. So we have -3 times 0 plus 5y is equal to 15. Same thing as before, that -3 times 0 term ends up going away. And so we're left with 5y equals 15. Divide both sides by 5. We get y is equal to 3. And so our y-intercept is 0, 3. Once we have the slope and the y-intercept, if we're putting them in this table, then it makes it easier for us to find the slope. Remember, the slope is our change in y over change in x. So in this case, our change in y would be -3 as we go from 3 to 0, over -5 as we go from 0 to -5. -3 over -5 would simplify to positive 3/5. So here we have x and y-intercepts of -5, 0, and 0, 3, and a slope of 3, 5. Now we're writing an equation for a graph, or for the graph in standard form. The slope of a horizontal line here, this makes it a little bit easier for us because the slope of all horizontal lines is 0. The y-intercept, this is where it crosses the y-axis, is at 0, -1. And so we can write the equation in slope-intercept form. because now we know the slope, which is 0, and the y-intercept, which is -1, so it'd be y equals 0x plus 1. That 0x part is going to end up going away, and so we're left with y equals -1. This is one of the cases where not only is our equation in slope-intercept form, but it is also in standard form, because that constant is by itself. And so really, to tell if it's in standard form, you'll see the x and the y term on one side and that constant by itself. When it's just y equals a number or x equals a number, what that's telling us is that the coefficient in front of the x or in front of the y was 0. So the a or the b in this case was 0. So here is not only our slope-intercept form equation, but also our standard form equation for this particular line. That's not always going to be the case though. So here we have an equation in slope-intercept form, and we're going to have to change it. We're going to have to convert it into standard form. So recall standard form is ax plus by equals c. The x and the y are by themselves, so are on the same side, and that constant's by itself. So I'm going to need to move this 1/2 x, and so we're going to move it to the other side. We're going to get it to the same side as y. We're going by subtracting on both sides. Here it goes away, and so what we have is 1/2 x plus y equals c. We want the x part first, then the y, and then our constant, which I don't need to write c. What I need to write is plus or equals 4. Okay. Here we have to check some things. So remember that a cannot be negative, and a, b, and c must be integers. And so because a is negative, we would need to multiply everything by -1. And because there's a fraction here, we would need to multiply also by the common denominator, which in this case would be 2. So this is our common denominator. So because I need to multiply by both of those, I could do them separately. I could multiply by -1 first, and then once we've done that, I could multiply by 2. But I could also multiply them simultaneously at the same time. And so instead of multiplying by -1 and then by 2, I can multiply the whole thing by -2. That'll take care of the negative part for a, and it will also get rid of that fraction. So when I do this, we're multiplying all three terms here. We're multiplying the a, the b, and the c by -2. So -2 times -1/2 becomes +1. -2 times y gives me -2y. And -2 times +4 gives us -8. And so here is our standard form of an equation, which is x minus 2y equals -8. Now the last thing you want to check is to see if the coefficient or the GCF between the three terms is 1. So a is 1, b is -2, and c is -8. And the GCF between 1, -2, and -8 is +1. Here we have an equation in point-slope form, and we're going to want to change this. We want to change this so that it's in standard form. What we would first have to do is we would first have to convert this into slope-intercept form, and then from slope-intercept form change it into standard form. So this one takes a little bit more work, so let's go ahead and get started. When we're changing to slope-intercept form, we are going to distribute the slope first. So this is 6 times x, which is 6x. 6 times 3, which is 18. And then we have y minus 1. And then remember to add 1 on both sides so that it's fully in slope-intercept form. So the slope-intercept form equation would be 6x plus 18. Now, we're putting it in standard form, and so to put it in standard form, we need to get the x and the y term on the same side, and this constant of 18 needs to be by itself, so that we have ax plus by equals c form. So we're gonna start by subtracting the 6x on both sides, so that the x and the y term are on the same side. So what we would have is -6x plus y equals +18. and then we need to check. So x and y are on the same side, 18 is by itself. So now really we're just checking to see are all the requirements followed. So a cannot be negative, and in this case a is negative, and so we're going to have to take care of that. A, B, and C cannot be fractions or decimals, so we're good there. So we really need to start by getting rid of that negative in front of the A. So remember, to get rid of negative in front of the A, we're going to multiply by -1. And so we're multiplying all three terms, the A, B, and the C term, by -1. So -1 times -6, that's -1 times y, and -1 times 18. So -1 times -6, that changes to 6x minus y equals to -18. And then the last thing to check is the GCF between the three terms +1. And so if we look for 6, -1, and -18, the GCF between these three terms is 1. Here we're going to write an equation. We can write this equation in standard form, but we're going to have to first write it in slope-intercept form. So remember, when we're writing in slope-intercept form, we need the slope and we need the y-intercept. So to find the slope, remember, we're looking at change in y, change in x. So I picked 2 points. In this case, it was just easy for us to pick the x and the y-intercepts. The y-intercept being 0, 1, the x-intercept being 2, 0. We're identifying the slope, so I'm going to go ahead and write my y-intercept, which was 0, 1. We're identifying the slope. So to get from 0, 1 to 2, 0, I go down 1, so change in y of -1. And I go forward 2, I go right 2, so that's a change in x of +2. So that makes our slope-intercept equation -1/2 x plus 1. Now, we're going to write this, we're going to change this form into standard form. So remember that when we're changing into standard form, our goal is to get it so that it's an ax plus by equals c form. So it means the x and the y term need to be on the same side. So we can do that by adding 1/2 x to both sides. This gives me 1/2 x plus y equals 1. And then a cannot be negative. We're good there. And then we can't have any fractions, so we are going to have to get rid of this 1/2. So remember, to get rid of 1/2, we multiply by the common denominator. So in this case, our common denominator is 2. So we're going to multiply everything by 2. All three terms, remember, are getting multiplied by 2, not just the 1/2. So 1/2 times 2 gives me x. Y times 2 gives me 2y, and then equals 2. So here's my standard form. And then our goal is to, again, check to see if the three terms, if A, which is 1, B, which is 2, and C, which is 2, if the GCF between those is 1, and the greatest common factor between the three terms here is 1. So my standard form of an equation here is x plus 2y equals 2. Here we're going to write an equation when we're given the 2 points. So first we're going to have to find the slope. So since we have 2 points, we can use our slope formula, which is that y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. Again, I label my points just so that I know where to put them. So we got -4 minus 2 over -2 minus 4. -4 minus 2, that's -6. -2 minus 4, that's also -6. So this gives us a slope of +1. So our slope is +1. Once we know the slope, remember that we can, and we have a point, we can write this in point slope form. So I'm just going to pick the easiest point to write, which is the +1. This is y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. Remember that we don't need to worry about the minus sign when we're putting in the point. We just put the point in. So we have y minus our y1, which is 2, our slope, which is 1, x minus our x1, which is 4. And so once we have that, then we can convert. Remember that we would distribute the slope first. Since we have A 1, I don't need to necessarily worry about distributing the slope. I can just write it as x minus 4. And then we would add the 2 to both sides so that it's in slope-intercept form. So in this case, the slope-intercept form equation would be y equals x minus 2. Once it's in slope-intercept form, then we can change it to standard form. Remember that when we're changing it to standard form, we're getting the x and the y term on the same side. So I would do that by subtracting x on both sides so that the x and the y are on the same side. And that constant of negative 2 is by itself. A, B, and C cannot be fractions. We're good there. But remember, A cannot be negative. And since we have a negative 1 for A, we need to get rid of that negative. And so we would multiply everything by negative 1. Remember, everything gets multiplied by negative 1, not just the x term. And so what we would have is x minus y equals 2. So x minus y equals 2. And then we're checking at this point to see if our GCF, which is 1, negative 1, and 2, if the GCF between those three terms is positive 1, and in this case it is. Alright, before watching the next video, please consider how to write standard form when you're given the x and the y intercepts. And as usual, please subscribe to the channel so that you get updates on when new videos are released.